Well, hello everyone, and welcome. Robert Breitbart here, Director of Educational Partnerships with Burlington English. And I am over the moon that you are taking the time from your busy work days to join us right now for this fantastic webinar that could not be more timely. What do new federal budget and policy developments mean for adult education? This is, like I say, just the very best time to be listening to two of some of the top folks from around the country to help all of us make sense of developments that have been going on for months, that developments in the last 24 hours, and developments, kind of a weather report, but along with a prognostication of what you should be considering doing once you log off from today's webinar. So again, from all of us at Burlington English, we thank you so much for caring so much about your students. With that, before I turn it over to those esteemed presenters, just a few housekeeping things. First off, let's practice some random acts of andragogy and do some adult learning. And you want to be participants in your own learning? Well, be loud and be proud. Well, your mics are cut, so you'll have to be loud and proud in the chat. So if you would, in the chat, please share your name, the program you're with, and what city and state you're viewing this, okay? So I hope that chat is exploding right now. I'm getting all excited. Yes, and you are full participants now in our own learning. A few other quick housekeeping items is you'll see that if you do want to share some comments, and by the way, we probably, with so many participants, we probably won't be able to get to everybody's questions, but I do promise you that we'll make sure everyone's questions and comments get to Amanda and Kathy, and give them some time, and we'll get those back to you maybe next week. All right. So just know your voices are heard. So again, if you change from panelists to all panelists and attendees. Few other quick things. This webinar will be recorded and will be available next week at burlingtonenglish.com. And down at the bottom, you'll see webinars. All this will be mentioned in there's that chat again, but all of this will be mentioned, as you can see in number 3 there, a follow-up email that you're going to get from us in about the next 24 hours or so, give or take. It'll have a certificate of participation. It'll, again, obviously have where you can find, this recorded webinar for any of your colleagues, friends that weren't able to make it today. You can reference that for them and give us just a little bit of time, but we'll make sure we also share the resources, web links and mentions that our presenters are going to share. We'll make sure that that comes to you in a follow-up email as well. So again, please, I hope that chat box just goes on and on and on. Where your name, where you're from, and what program you're with or have been with most recently. So with that, I couldn't think again of better folks to give us a snapshot of what's been going on, what's going on the federal level from Amanda, and then what would we be doing as soon as we log off from this, as far as being at the local level, what action steps should we take from Dr. Kathy. So with that, turn it over and I'll let our presenters introduce themselves. Amanda, if you want to lead us off, please, just alphabetically.
Hi, Robert, and thanks so much to you and Burlington English for organizing this. I couldn't think of anybody I'd rather be having this conversation with than Kathy, so delighted to be here sharing the stage. I'm Amanda Berkson-Chilcock. I am a senior fellow at National Skills Coalition. We are a Big Tent bipartisan coalition of workforce and education advocates, and I specialize in adult education. I come to this work after having spent 9 years in direct service at the Welcoming Center in Philadelphia. So shout out to all my Pennsylvania people who I saw in the chat. It's lovely to see your virtual faces. Kathy?
Well, hi, everyone. My name is Kathy Olson Tracy, and I am the Senior Director for Adult Education and Literacy. We sure like to put big titles on things. The State Director for Adult Education, Title II in Illinois. I have been involved in adult education for 29 years, ranging from the intake coordinator to a program director to a professional development provider, and all the way through curriculum development. And now I have the privilege of serving my state as our state director. And certainly I want to acknowledge the unrest many people are feeling right now, but we have a path. We have a path forward. And I'm really glad that you're here to learn about how we can do this together and continue to serve our adult learners.
Awesome. Kathy, thanks so much. I'm going to take the lead on the first set of slides here, and I'm going to just reassure folks, as Robert said, you will get a copy of the slides and the recording. So there's a lot of information in my slides. For some of you who work on policy issues pretty regularly, this may be familiar in parts. For some of you who are pretty focused on direct service, this may not be sort of nitty-gritty information that you think about all the time. So my hope is that you'll find this helpful and not overwhelming. Next slide. So where do we stand right now with adult education funding on the last day of July 2025 here? Next slide. I'm about to walk you through 4 different pieces of overall federal budget legislation. And I'm listing them out on the slide here because a lot of the news coverage of this legislation has been confusing. It's hard to know what's already passed, what hasn't passed, what's still being debated. So we're going to talk first about the fiscal year 2025 annual appropriations. That's the program and fiscal year that we're in right now. And that funding is currently in effect. That's why it's in green here. We're going to talk about very briefly about the budget rescission bill that Congress passed, clawing back some funding. None of the funding that got clawed back was adult ed money, but that is currently in effect. We're going to talk about the budget reconciliation bill that passed at the beginning of July and which is being implemented in pieces over the next 3 or 4 years. And then we're going to talk about the upcoming fiscal year 2026 annual appropriations process, which has not yet been passed by Congress. It's a lot of different pieces of legislation. I am going to be available for lots of questions today, but I'm also going to give you my contact information. My job is to be here to answer your questions. So please do not be shy about following up with me after the webinar today if you have more clarifying questions. Next slide. Okay, let's zoom in on the part of the budget that actually focuses on adult education. And I'll be mostly referring to this as we owe a Title II. That's the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Title II. That legislation is also called AFLA, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. Next slide. So the federal fiscal year runs from October through September. The state fiscal year, and of course all of our program years, run from July 1st to June 30th. And I know you all know that, you all live and breathe that, but I'm flagging it because I do think this often gets confused in news coverage about these issues. Back in March, Congress passed a spending bill that should have sent the rest of the WIOA Title II or AFLA money to the states. Instead, that money got held up at the US Department of Education. And I know that 23,000 of you spoke up through COABE's advocacy materials, and many hundreds and thousands more did visits to your Congress people, made phone calls, sent letters, trying to ask your Congress people to ask the federal government, meaning the Office of Management and Budget and the Department of Education, to release those funds. That is an amazing act of advocacy, and you should all be very proud of having participated in it. The money has been released. There are some conditions attached to it, although at least in the paperwork that I've seen so far, most of those conditions are pretty straightforward. Okay, next slide. So that was the FY25 appropriations. There's also the budget reconciliation legislation, which passed in early July. I want to be really clear, and that's why this language is in bright red. This legislation does not directly affect WIOA Title II or AFLA, but it absolutely will affect many adult learners and probably some adult educators if they are on SNAP or food stamps, as some people still call them, or Medicaid. This is huge omnibus legislation. It includes an enormous range of impacts. Um, for example, new work requirements, which mean that some folks who have been on Medicaid may need to enroll in an education or training program or find a job in order to keep their benefits. There are changes to the child tax credit. There's increased immigration enforcement funding. Most of the news coverage around that has focused on enforcement against undocumented immigrants, but I want to be clear that the enforcement funding can touch many more of our learners and our instructors because it also includes money that will allow the federal government to increase denaturalization, which is a fancy word that means taking US citizenship away from people who already have it. Denaturalization has previously been a very rare thing that happened only to war criminals and people with really horrific histories, but the administration has signaled they would like to use it more broadly. And about half of all immigrants in this country are US citizens. There are also changes to Pell Grants and federal student financial aid in the bill, which includes some potential areas of good news for adult learners who might want to take a short-term program at the community college level. So that's the big, beautiful bill act. Next slide. Then there's a budget rescission bill, right? And the term you'll hear all the time in the news is clawback, right? This is money that Congress passed, that Congress approved. None of the money that got clawed back has anything to do with adult education. What you probably saw in news headlines is that it was USAID funding for international development work and PBS, public broadcasting funding primarily that was rescinded. The reason I have this slide here is that even though there's no budget rescission that affects adult education right now, something that a lot of folks are thinking about is how do we know there won't be other attempts to do budget rescission going forward? So that is a topic that I think is likely to keep coming up in the months ahead. Next slide. And then the fourth and final area is the FY26 adult ed funding. And again, remember that this is covering the federal fiscal year that starts this October and ends in September of 2026. The president put out his budget proposal in the spring. You might have heard about this referred to in the news as the president's skinny budget or the president's budget request or the PBR. The administration proposed completely zeroing out adult education funds. So going from about $715 million a year to zero. However, in the last 15 years, Congress has never enacted any president's budget as proposed. Congress is the one where the spending bills originate, and Congress usually has their own opinions for how they would like to approach something. So I think it's really important to understand that the administration is seeking to eliminate adult education, but it's also important to understand that our target in appropriations conversations really is Congress. Frankly, there's not enough time for Congress to pass the different spending bills that together make up the budget before the September 30th end of fiscal year. They're on their August recess right now, which in normal person terms is vacation. And they just don't have time to get all this done. So there will probably be a short-term continuing resolution to fund the federal government. And we don't know how long that CR might be. And we don't know whether they're going to manage to pass it by September 30th. We're just not clear on a lot of things at this point. So I just want to pause there for a second and again say for those of you who've joined us in the last few minutes, I'm happy to answer questions in the chat. We also have Q&A time at the end of our comments today, and I'll put my contact information out. My job is to answer your questions. We're probably not going to get to every single question today. And so I will work with Robert and Burlington English to make sure that we get back to you with answers to your questions. Okay, so next slide. That was a lot of information. And the research says that if you look at a picture of nature for at least 30 seconds, your blood pressure actually goes down. There's also research that says that if a hospital patient's window looks out onto trees and nature instead of onto a building or industrial things, their wounds will actually heal faster. So that is why we are getting a beautiful photo of trees in between our conversation on federal budget issues and our conversation on federal policy issues. I would also note that these trees are a lot older than any one piece of budget legislation, and they will be standing a lot longer than any one budget bill. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next slide. We're going to do what adult educators do best. We are going to roll up our sleeves and get to work to protect our learners, to run our programs, and to really be as thoughtful as we can in not just reacting, but being thoughtful about what is coming across our plates. Okay, next slide. I said this before. Congratulations to all of you who have been contacting your congresspeople, inviting them to your student events, having your students and learners themselves lobby or educate congresspeople. If you're not allowed to lobby in your job, you can still do education. You can still send your newsletter to your elected officials, not just at the federal level, right? At the state level too. Making the case for adult education has never been more important. And I know many of you are tirelessly advocating already, and I just want to encourage you to keep doing that. I have some links later on in my slides with some resources. Next slide. Okay. So we're going to change gears now. We're going to talk a little bit about policy. Next slide. So in the last few weeks, there have been some new policy developments that affect adult education. Next slide. So again, adult education, also called WIOA Title II funding. There was recently an interagency agreement between the Department of Labor and the Department of Education that agreed that some functions of OCTE, the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, would move over, in practical terms, over to the Department of Labor. Interagency agreements are really common across different presidents and administrations, but the specifics really matter. And in the case of this interagency agreement, my organization, National Skills Coalition, is very concerned that the field was not consulted, that the input from stakeholders like adult educators was simply not something that folks had a chance to voice or ask questions or raise concerns about. We are seriously concerned about the interagency agreement because there just wasn't that substantive engagement that we would have wanted to see before any functions got moved around within government. DOL really doesn't have a history of engaging in adult education and really doesn't have in-house expertise on adult education issues. And all of us know that our learners deserve people who know and understand the challenges and the opportunities that they're facing. Next slide. There's also additional policy guidance, or rather a policy interpretation that came out from the Department of Education. It is regarding a piece of legislation known as PROWORA, which is a very awkward and hard to say word. It stands for the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. It's more commonly referred to as the 1996 Welfare Reform Law. The July 2025 policy interpretation that the Department of Education issued was in response to an executive order that the Trump administration had put out back in January. And the ed policy guidance that came out in July revoked or kind of overruled a 1997 policy guidance that had been in effect for almost 30 years. There's a lot of lack of clarity in the new policy language. I have been answering many, many questions from many of you about this. We can talk more about it, but there is a really confusing lack of clarity in this guidance, and that has caused a lot of confusion. Next slide. It has caused so much confusion, in fact, that more than 20 states have actually filed a lawsuit against this new policy. Next slide. And those states have gotten an agreement with the court and with the federal government that the federal government will not try to enforce the new policy until at least September 4th in the 20 states that are part of the lawsuit. And for the other 25 states that are not part of the lawsuit, the original policy remains in effect. And this is where that language gets confusing, right? On the one hand, the language says the policy is not binding. On the other hand, it says it may be used when taking enforcement actions in states after August 9th. So there's a lot of uncertainty still. And if you're experiencing that uncertainty, I hear you, I see you, and there's a lot of folks working to try to resolve that. Okay, next slide. There's also new guidance for our fellow WIOA Title I partners. That is the workforce side of folks, the folks who are at workforce development boards, American Job Centers. Your state probably has its own name for AJCs, so it could be a Career Link in Pennsylvania, a Workforce Solution Center in Texas, Michigan Works in Michigan. And I've put on the slide here a few links to different TEGLs, training and employment guidance letters for those workforce partners. I'm flagging them because some of these will end up affecting adult education. And we can talk more about that, not in the immediate future, but in the months and potentially years to come. And I'm happy to talk about that more, but it has to do with the fact that when WIOA passed in 2014, Department of Labor and Department of Education did joint rulemaking around the WIOA performance measures. And so what that means is if DOL issues some guidance related to performance measures, then Department of Ed will also issue some guidance, but it hasn't come out yet. Okay, so next slide. That takes us through a lot of information, which might be feeling like too much information at this point, or a big tangle. Next slide. Oops. So there are really three steps that I encourage folks to take. Make sure you are in contact with your state adult education. That is your equivalent of Kathy in your state, to make sure that you're getting state-specific guidance. Make sure that you're continuing to speak up, to educate policymakers about the value of adult education, right? Even if you can't weigh in on specific pieces of legislation, which depending on your job, you might or might not be able to do, you can absolutely talk about the value of adult ed to your learners. And I've linked to COABE's great advocacy website, NASDA's one-pagers, which exist for every single state, and then my own organization's website. And now Kathy's going to talk to you about how you can stay focused on the North Star of adult education. And I'm going to take a look at the chat and see what kinds of questions have been bubbling up. After Kathy's comments, we're going to come back and Robert's going to facilitate a little Q&A with folks. So we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay, let's talk about what this looks like in managing change. And, currently we serve every student that walks in our door, right? They come in, they find us, word of mouth, marketing, outreach, they come to us, we serve everybody. This is going to be able to continue, but we might have to continue it differently. So as you're thinking about how we operate tomorrow, I'm going to encourage you to start fostering relationships with your local state libraries, your local foundations, community partners, to build bridges to support all of our learners and to continue serving them. As we are very unclear of what those next steps look like, conditions from the federal government, but to continue to serve our learners through enhanced relationships, Dollar General literacy grant services, Kiwanis, all of your local community organizations, your foundations. It's time to start thinking about how we expand our portfolio to be able to serve our students. And we're also going to continue working in that work-based learning space and training people for the career, the job, the sustainable life that they deserve to have. So change is coming. How we adapt and pivot to it is going to be a little different, but we're going to be able to get there. So I want to kind of get to your North Star, and we have a poll here that I'd like to have them launch. Okay, what outcome do you believe best defines success in adult education? This is a single choice. We'll have that for a couple seconds and we'll be able to see the results. Okay, can we see the results? It's interesting that 44% of us think that building confidence and lifelong learning skills. And we look at the need for improving employment opportunities as probably only 24% of us feel that that's our North Star. I find that interesting that we have 8% of us who think that our North Star is to support transitions to college or career training. So we're building a set of lifelong learning. That's a wonderful goal. So we're going to go to the next poll because I want to get a sense of what our history of adult education has been. And adult education from a federal support impact is 60 years old this year. So can we launch the next poll? Okay, where do we begin? So I'd like you to think about, when did adult education begin to strongly align with workforce employability skills? And just high level, 1966, when we began our federal work within adult education, or when we reauthorized the Adult Education Act, when it became the National Literacy Act, the Workforce Investment Act, or the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. These are all the guiding legislation that supports the federal investment in adult education. Okay, if we can kind of see the results. Wonderful. We see that many of us believe that the emphasis for workforce alignment began in 1998. The reason I'm looking at that before we really get into how are we going to move forward is just kind of a quick look at where we began. In 1966, the idea of the federal investment was to build an economic pathway and improve the economic status for our adult learners. When it was reauthorized in the 80s, we were partnering with a program called Job Training Partnership Act, JTPA. This is kind of when I joined into adult ed, we were under JTPA. Again, strengthening that connection to workforce training. As we moved into the Literacy Act of 1991, we started recognizing that students needed to have that improved literacy to order to get the careers and the sustainable outcomes that they needed. And again, Workforce Investment Act and then the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act really strengthen those emphasis from the federal investment into that employability and the idea of education being an economic mobility for many learners. So we're not stranding in today's conversation too far from where we've been for the last 60 years. You know, we've been looking at adult education as an economic driver and sustainable lifeblood for many of our learners. So where are we going? And how do we start our job tomorrow? At the end of the day, today we're going to go home, we're going to catch our breath, and what is our mission for tomorrow? We are going to continue to emphasize employability skills. We're going to continue to look at credential attainment, a skilled workforce development, and economic sustainable futures. This has not changed from the 1966 original investment. And then we're going to focus on industry recognized credentials. These are the outcomes of where we're at. And when I talk about credential attainment and an industry recognized credential, that is a credential that somebody can use to get a better job. they can become employable and actually earn a living and actually go beyond housing insecurity, go beyond food insecurity, and go beyond some of the basic needs. So as we're moving forward, we're looking at how do we blend this desire to make our students lifelong learners, to blend that mission that we have into serving our adult learners and aligning it with that federal investment towards workforce training. We're going to talk about some tangible steps. And this is kind of a heavy slide to look at. There's a lot of text on this one, but I wanted to kind of break these steps down. When we talk about what our next steps are, so many of our students walk in the door and they say they want to improve their English language and they want to or get their high school diploma. And that's their goal. But then we need to take that step a deeper dive and say, why do you want that goal? What is in that goal for you? Why do we need there? And what we often hear over 90% of the time is they want to get that high school diploma so that they can get a better job. They want to get that English language skill so that they can go into employment, so that they can improve their environment at the personal home and economic sustainability. So what are the steps that we can do tomorrow? We can look at our recruitment, our intake, and our orientation. Is that process aligned so that we are meeting our students' goals? Why are they coming in and how are we serving them? Is there alignment between the two of those? This is huge. What can we do tomorrow to stay in alignment with these federal investments and to serve our students well? We can do mock job interviews in the classroom. We can connect students to job fairs. We can take them or even have job fairs on site. We can invite academic advisors to our classroom to help smooth that transition to higher education. Talk to local employers. We know that we're not talking to our local employers to say, what is it you need so that my student can come into your job and earn a living? So these are things that we can walk away with tomorrow, and we can actually start working in step with the new regulations. Where are we going? What's really interesting to me is over the last several years, we've been talking about integrated education and training programs. And you hear that language, but what does that really mean? It really means that our focus in the new reality is focusing on students and helping them build those pathways, build that basic literacy, create that pathway to lifelong learning, understand how to get those credentials so that they can walk out of our program building their literacy skills with the opportunity to find sustainable employment. And this is the direction that we are going with the law. This is a direction that we are going with the services. And it's a direction our students need and often want. When they ask us, why are you here? It's that deeper dive into that question of why. And many times it's because they want to get that job. They want to improve their job. They want to go from a part-time to a full-time employer. They want to get benefits on their job. They want to be able to pay their rent. So what we're doing is making sure that we are aligned with that student need, and our alignment is between what we're expected to do, but most importantly, what we need to do with our students and what their goals are, taking that deeper dive into it. This is a big thing that we're talked about in adult education under the legislation that guides us in our system. Amanda talked about WIOA. So many of you as frontline practitioners might have questions about what is co-enrollment and why is this a thing and why do I have to care about IETs? Well, in our system that we have now, we are working in partnership with Department of Labor. We are working in partnership with education providers so that we can provide services to our students. Co-enrollment is a big way of saying that we are working in collaboration with each other so that our students get all of their needs met and they can continue to work on that education and continue that pathway forward. The idea behind this is that we are maximizing our resources. So in our programs, we're working on those basic skills, that lifelong learning, that occupational training, that job placement. We're partnering with our providers, and you might hear it differently in different states, but your American Job Centers or your one-stops, it might be called something different in your state, but we're working with our partners so that we can serve our adult learners. This avoids duplication of services so that we are working in step and maximizing resources at the local level. I know your resources are tight. So if you're going to co-enroll a student, they're going to get some support services from one of the partners, and you can focus on that education and that basic skills development. And why this is so important is when we look at our data, this is national data for the last several years about how many of our students are displaced homemakers, are exhausting TANF within 2 years, or are homeless, or all of the ways that we understand that they're struggling. The idea of co-enrollment is to support this learner with services through all of our partners. So as you're working, one step that you can do is talk to your partners. Go meet them. Understand what that local center can offer you. Talk about how do you get those students those services that they deserve and have access to through our partnerships. It's making those steps to understand that if you have an individual with a disability, where does that support come from? Well, in the WIOA law, it comes from what we call Title IV, the Department of Vocational and Rehabilitation Services, so that they can support that individual learner. What do we do with that student who is a long-term unemployed? Well, they can also come in and build those basic skills with us and get support from what we call Title I in our partnership. That's Department of Economic and Community Opportunities, DECO. That is so important because they can provide services to support that individual. They can pay for training for that individual. They can cover the cost for equipment for that individual. So when we talk about co-enrollment, we're really talking about how we are supporting that student through our system. And if you're looking at what that next step looks like in the uncertainty right now, it is building those relationships with those partners. It is calling your American Job Center, finding out who your partner is, talking to them and saying, how do I work with you? I have a student who needs services. How do I connect them to those services? This co-enrollment is critical for the success of our students, and it's really built into our program. So the system is there to serve our students. So understanding that and making those connections is one of the best things that you can do to support your students. Wow. Thinking about next steps. Okay, what is it that you can do tomorrow? Tomorrow, we can talk about, if you're a teacher, integrating employability skills in your classroom, helping your students understand what opportunities exist for them. Often, our students don't even realize that that opportunity and that availability is there. I spent a decade in the classroom. I taught up until 2019 when I took this job. Our students don't always know that that door is opening for them. So our job as a classroom teacher is to really help them understand everything that is available to them once they complete their education. How do we improve that foundational skill development? Work with your state and professional development system to understand the outcomes that we are measured by, because we can get them there. We have some of the best teachers in the country, right? But understanding why we have a pretest, so we know where to begin with our students, so we know where that placement starts. Why do we have a post-test requirement? So that we understand that that student is making progress and that we can adapt our instruction to meet that student's needs and then help them find their pathway. So working with your state office, your professional development providers to understand the metrics that we're being held accountable to. And those metrics are really showing that our work is connecting to those students' needs and our students are progressing through our system. Their literacy is improving, their English language is improving, their math skills are improving, and they're improving in a way that's going to help them build a sustainable career, a sustainable job. Understand industry recognized credentials. When you go back to your program, look at what is available in your area that these students can qualify for, that we have built into your program. Start thinking about pathways and how you can start talking about that in your classroom. If you're an intake person, how do you welcome your students into your program so that you can help them pick a pathway and know what credentials that they can even earn, that are within their grasp, as they continue on their education? If you're a program administrator, what are the industry credentials that are available at your institution, in your community, and how can you link your students to those opportunities? Our students desperately often want a way to move into sustainable futures. And these are pathways within education that we can get them there. Most importantly, well, I wouldn't say most importantly, but also importantly, understand the pre-apprenticeship landscape. You're going to hear a lot of conversations in policy about the road and pathway to apprenticeships. And these registered apprenticeships, pay as you play, pay as you go kind of opportunities, give students a really strong pathway. My son-in-law took an apprenticeship program to a stabilized future, and it was one of the best things he ever did. So how do we create that opportunity for our students? And our students often are in that pre-apprenticeship phase. They're building the vocabulary so that they can get into that apprenticeship. They're learning the credentials that they can have. So one of the best ways that we can prepare our students for the reality of the world that we're existing in right now is to create those pathways and understand what a pre-apprenticeship is. And finally, to build partnerships with our local communities to support our learners, to follow COABE and see the advocacy and the work that they're doing in this space, the guidance that they can provide. Follow your state professional development and your state advocacy boards and see what information they're putting out so you can always stay connected with your mission and your course materials and the outcomes that we are held accountable to. Work with your local Rotary, your Kiwanis, your service organizations, and bring that voice to them to show them the value of the work that we bring to our students and to our communities. One of the most resonating pieces of the advocacy of those 23,000 outreaches to representatives was the impact, the economic impact into a local community and to a student's life from their increased literacy, from obtaining their GED, from getting that job. We are showing that we are an economic value to our communities. And that carried a lot of weight when it came to, yes, we're going to release these funds, because we could prove documentation wise the value that we have to our community. So build those relationships with your local communities, and we can continue to do the good work that we need to do. It was a very high level and high paced summary, but at heart, what we are doing is connecting the needs of our student. Why are they here? That deeper dive into what are their real goals, and then aligning our instruction that gets them there. And you will be amazed at how aligned that student's goal is to that idea of a sustainable economic future. Okay. I think that we're going to go into some question and answers because I'm seeing a lot of questions come in, and I'm going to see what you guys have for us.
Amanda, if I might, just looking over a lot of the questions, just as we have time to give you time to take a look at some of those. Amanda, what would you continue to uh, keep on top of as far as policies, development, what's going on in DC, what's possibly even going on in our state legislatures? What are the top things you see?
Yeah, so the thing I see the most questions about in the chat is something that I went over pretty quickly in my remarks, so I just want to clarify. The policy interpretation that the Department of Education just put out a couple of weeks ago would require states' adult education programs to screen more participants for their immigration status. Right now, there's only a small handful of states, I think it's 4 or 5, that actually screen for immigration status for adult ed programs. This would be a significant change if it happens. Actually, Kathy, if you can scroll back to the slide that I have about this, because of the lawsuit that's been filed, there's definitely not going to be any enforcement of this provision before August 9th in any state, and definitely not until September 4th in the 20 states that have sued as part of the lawsuit. There's a lot of moving parts here, and I want to go deeper on two of them just for clarification purposes. The federal government is arguing, yeah, perfect. Thanks, Kathy. The federal government is arguing that because of the 1996 welfare reform law, that states should be required to screen for immigration status for adult ed because they're arguing that adult ed counts as a public benefit. That is not a statement that is agreed to by everybody. That's part of why there's this lawsuit. The second thing is that even if they're arguing that the 1996 welfare reform law applies, that law and IIRA, which is another 1990s era immigration law, make it very clear that nonprofit organizations cannot be required to have to screen for immigration status for any one of a huge range of public services. So even if they won on the question of whether ProWara applies to adult ed, it's unclear that at least the adult ed providers that are nonprofits would have to do this. Um, Another factor that's a question mark in the litigation is the administrative burden of having to screen for immigration status. That adds a lot of paperwork for programs. I mentioned before that there's a handful of states that have state level legislation on this question. So folks in places like Georgia or Tennessee or Arizona have already been living with a version of this policy for a while. I know we have some Arizona folks here today who are real experts in the topic. There are ways for programs to continue to do as much good work as possible, even in an environment where there are new immigration restrictions. So I want to be clear about that. And then the last piece I want to emphasize that is also, at this point unclear and unsettled, is, there's an argument that the administration is making is that this somehow is affiliated with post-secondary education. But adult education is adult basic education and adult secondary education. And I don't think they have a strong argument on the question of the connection to post-secondary. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I can't give legal advice. This is a very rapidly changing area of the law. What I will say in the very short term is the federal government has agreed that they are not enforcing any part of this in any state until at least August 9th. And then in the 20 states plus the District of Columbia that have sued, they're not going to enforce until at least September 4th. And that your state Department of Adult Education is probably working on some formal or informal guidance for your state about how to proceed. And again, our friends in the 4 or 5 states that do this kind of screening already have some experience with it and have some wisdom to offer the rest of us. I will also flag that these restrictions only have to do with federal funds. They don't have to do with how states use their own money unless your state has a law that defines adult education as a public benefit. It also doesn't have to do with how you spend your foundation money, generally speaking. So again, I can't give legal advice. I am not a lawyer. You should be talking to your state director of adult ed. And I want to give Kathy a chance to weigh in here because she's sitting in a very different vantage point than I am and may have other observations to offer.
While every state is currently looking at the conditions and figuring out what that means for their state, and certainly I'm going to ask that you give them all time to work through this and to be supportive of our learners. One key thing to think about is if your state money is your match, then the match must adhere to the same federal guidelines. So it's not as clean cut as the state can do this much and then the federal can do this. There are some connections in there that we're all trying to work through and figure out what that looks like and what that means. This is, by the way, not new. We've thought about this many times over many years about what those match requirements and maintenance of effort mean when it comes to that. So to clarify, it's not as easy as your state money, you can do X, and your federal money, you do Y, especially if your state money is the match, the 25% required match for the federal investment. So there are some complexities in how this lays out, and every state does that differently. So I'm going to ask that you give a little bit of grace to your state offices as they are working quickly, rapidly, with intense timelines, because we know what needs to happen, but they're still trying to figure this all out. So just give them a little bit of grace as all of this is coming very quickly. So do we have any additional questions?
Yeah, I'm seeing a bunch in the chat. Robert, do you want me to make a call on a couple to respond to? Do you have one that you want to lift up?
Please go right ahead. And once again to everybody, we're going to supply everything from the chat and the Q&A to our presenters, and they'll get back with you next week. But sure, Amanda, Kathy, I'm sure you've got some ones that are jumping out at you.
Yeah, so a few things. A lot of questions in the chat about the appropriations markup on the FY26 money. So again, this is the money for the federal fiscal year that begins this coming October 1st. The president proposed to zero out the money. The Senate Appropriations Committee met this morning and is proposing to level fund the money, which would keep us at $729 million. I had conversations with staff members for House elected officials earlier in July that indicate to me the House is inclined to cut, not as much as the president wants them to cut, but certainly inclined to cut. So that's why advocacy is going to be really, really important in the next 6 weeks or so. So, your voice very much needed. Um, Other questions I saw in the chat. I saw questions about whether adult education centers are protected from ICE. So again, the caveat, I am not a lawyer. I can't give legal advice. I can tell you two things. One is the Trump administration has revoked the ICE protected areas policy. The protected areas policy basically said we're not going to conduct ICE enforcement actions at sensitive locations like churches and schools and hospitals and courts because we think it's important that people be able to go to those places. This administration has revoked that guidance. So that layer of protection is gone. Having said that, that's not the only layer of protection. And I would point folks to the good folks at the Immigration Legal Resource Center, which I'm putting in the chat here, and the National Immigration Law Center, which both have really terrific resources about what to do in the event of ICE visiting your school or place of work. So if folks want to go deeper on that question, those are two great resources. There was a question about whether Congress will push back against the president's budget proposal. The Senate is generally more inclined to push back than the House for a variety of reasons. One thing that is very tricky and that we are in totally new territory on, I want to be very clear. Congress can pass a bipartisan spending agreement with a majority of 60 votes in the Senate. And then if they turn around and pass a budget rescission package, clawing back some of that money, as they just did with the PBS money and the USAID money, they can do that vote with 51 votes. And so what a lot of Democrats on Capitol Hill have been saying publicly is we are concerned about engaging in a bipartisan negotiation process on a budget if the Republicans can turn around and override our bipartisan agreement with a rescission vote. We are in totally new territory on this question. I don't think anybody can make an accurate prediction about what's likely to happen. What I can tell you is that Congress responds to pressure. And so the louder and more clear we can get, the better. I do want to address one piece of complete misinformation. It is absolutely not the case that anybody has proposed that adult ed would only be allowed to serve U.S. citizens. That proposal is nowhere. There are proposals around checking for work authorization. That is not the same as checking for U.S. citizenship. So I want to be really clear about that. There's a question about the Adult Ed Works Act from Senator Reid and Senator Young. That is still languishing in committee. It hasn't moved at all in Congress. And then there's a question, this is a little in the weeds question, the the question about SNAP benefits. right? So we talked before about how the budget reconciliation bill that passed in early July would make changes to Medicaid work requirements. In the past, if the federal government has imposed work requirements, they would usually count participation in an education or training program like adult ed as meeting the work requirement. In this moment, I cannot promise you that will still be the case, but I suspect that it will still be the case. And we can certainly share more information about this in the months ahead as the federal government releases information. Um, Kathy, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on questions that we haven't gotten to yet.
There was a question in the chat about next steps, what we can do as providers. And there was a comment about shouldn't we be working with our English language learners in translating their skills into employability skills and getting their credentials in this recognized here. And I would say absolutely that's the step that we're taking. We were very glad to see that when federal funding was released, it did include IELCE funds, and that those funds are for often to be used for professionals with credentials in their own country. But yes, that is absolutely a next step to include as we look at how do we serve our students and working within those spaces for our English language learners as important as everything else that we are doing. So I just wanted to call out, yes, that is absolutely a next step that we can work on. And actually learning and sharing within your program how to talk to your English language learners and ask them what credentials they have in their home country. You know, ask them what skill sets they had from their home country, and then work with your institution to find out how you get those skill sets recognized and counted in this country. So I wanted to call out to say, yes, that is still one of our next steps.
Ladies, as
And
we
I,
come to our hour, I just want to say thank you beyond thank you. And to everyone listening, before you log off, please, really quick, the recording of this webinar will be available next week, burlingtonenglish.com. We've got a webinar link down at the bottom of our page. Next Monday, you'll get a follow-up email from us with the resources that have been shared and also questions. We'll look to provide everything from the chat and the Q&A to our presenters to get back with you. And also apprenticeships came up. Apprenticeships came up, and everything you wanted to know about apprenticeships we're afraid to ask, and that you can find out in an hour will be coming up. Look for an email for an invitation to a webinar again on August 6th. That's next Wednesday. Special thanks to Corey Lupton from Cuyahoga Community College and Dr. Amber Gallup from New Mexico to be talking about that. We're definitely here at Burlington to help you every step of the way. But if I could get a huge virtual round of applause to Amanda and to Kathy, just really fantastic work. Thanks for all your help. And so again, as everyone is logging off, you can send us off there, Kathy and Amanda. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. And if you wanted to type in one of your takeaways in the chat before you signed off, that'd be great too.
Yes,
But
if you
we
don't
will
have to run, we'd love, feel free, put in the chat if you, I always like that. It's a great wrap up. If you walk away with, if you just have to distill one or two things, one from Amanda, one from Kathy, I think we all learn from one another. Yeah.
yeah,
and,
please do. And you will have my contact information when you get these slides, and I am here to answer questions at any time.
Oh, and from the shameless promotion department, if you're not already on the National Skills Coalition mailing list, make sure that you are. Make sure that you follow them on LinkedIn. And as both of our presenters said, it's never too late to put an extra push to advocacy. So if you're not already, thank you to Sharon Bonney and to all the folks at COABE for doing their tireless work. And this is no time to let up. It's actually a time to speed up. So if you're not already on the COABE advocacy page, everything's presented there for you. So,
And while we have some despair and angst and painful decisions, it's also time to move forward and continue that North Star of helping our students improve their literacy so that they can land with a roof over their head and food on their table and all of the things that they deserve.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, everybody. Again, to our presenters, have a wonderful afternoon. And to our presenters, I'm going to send you a link for a quick debrief if you had a minute. And everyone, I'll see you next Wednesday, August 6th, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time for apprenticeships. Take good care, everyone. Bye bye now.
Sounds great.